July 8, 1944. The northern tip of Saipan trembled with the last desperate echoes of a battle that had already swallowed tens of thousands of lives. Smoke clung to the ridges, drifting in slow, stubborn curtains as American Marines advanced toward a maze of caves where Japanese soldiers and terrified civilians had gathered. Most of them had been told the same thing from the beginning. Surrender meant dishonor, torture, and a gruesome death. Mothers clutched grenades to their chests. Fathers whispered that survival was no longer an option. Children were told that to fall into American hands would be worse than dying. On that island, the atmosphere was not only thick with gunpowder, it was poisoned by propaganda. Into this setting walked Private First Class Guy Gabaldon, just 18 years old, weighing barely over 100 pounds. He was no towering figure of combat, no grim veteran hardened by years of war. He looked more like a neighborhood kid than a conquering soldier. Yet this teenager carried something far rarer than brute strength. He carried words, and he knew how to use them. He had grown up in East Los Angeles, raised not only in his Mexican-American family, but taken in as a boy by the Nano family, Japanese Americans who had shared with him their language, their customs, and the quiet rituals of honor and respect. At 12, he had sat at their dinner table. At 15, he had learned their turns of phrase. By the time war came and the Nanos were sent away to an internment camp, Guy carried with him a piece of their world that no boot camp could ever teach. When he enlisted in the Marines at 17, he was driven by equal measures of patriotism and personal conviction. His Japanese was not academic, not polished by dictionaries or grammar charts. It was alive, conversational, colored with idioms that only someone who had listened for years around a kitchen stove could wield. And now on Saipan, those words would matter more than any rifle he carried. As night fell, he slipped away from his unit, against orders, with nothing but his courage and his voice. He crept toward the mouths of caves where armed men and frightened families huddled in darkness. Instead of barking commands through a bullhorn, instead of demanding surrender in the stiff tones of military Japanese, he spoke like a neighbor. He spoke of food, of safety, of how those who came out would not be beaten, would not be shamed, would not be left to starve. He painted an alternative picture, one utterly alien to those who had been told that Americans were devils who devoured children. It worked. Slowly, cautiously, shadows emerged from the caves. First a soldier, trembling, then a mother carrying a baby, then a group of civilians who laid down the crude weapons they had been told to use against Marines. Word began to spread within his own unit. This boy could do what flamethrowers and grenades could not. He could save lives by unspooling lies that had been hammered into people's minds. That night was only the beginning. By the end of the campaign, Guy Gabaldon would walk back to American lines with hundreds, and eventually more than 1,000 men, women, and children who should have been lost to the cliffs or to their own weapons. On Saipan, one Marine dared to speak rather than shoot, and in doing so reshaped the story of the battle. The road that led Guy Gabaldon to Saipan stretched far from the beaches of the Pacific. It began in the crowded neighborhoods of East Los Angeles, where he was born on March 22, 1926, the son of a struggling Mexican-American family during the dark years of the Depression. Life was lean, food was scarce, and survival demanded resourcefulness. At 12, his path shifted in a way no one could have predicted. He went to live with the Nano family, Japanese Americans who opened their home and treated him as one of their own. In their modest house, Guy was immersed in a new culture. He ate rice and fish instead of tortillas and beans, practiced polite bows at the table, and absorbed the rhythms of a language most of his neighbors barely recognized. At first, the words stumbled off his tongue, awkward and uncertain, but years of constant exposure turned hesitation into fluency. More importantly, he learned the subtleties, phrases shaded with respect, the importance of silence in conversation, the weight of honor in daily life. These lessons were not taught in classrooms, but lived at dinner, in laughter, in whispered arguments behind closed doors. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything. In a matter of weeks, the Nano family, like 120,000 other Japanese Americans, was torn from their home by Executive Order 9066. They were sent to the Heart Mountain internment camp in Wyoming, their lives stripped away with a stroke of a pen. Guy watched helplessly as the people who had embraced him were forced onto trains, their possessions reduced to what they could carry. The injustice etched itself into his memory. He was old enough to feel the sting of betrayal, young enough to believe he could do something about it. At 17, he enlisted in the Marines. Too small to intimidate, too young to seem hardened, he nonetheless carried a quiet weapon, a voice shaped by years in a Japanese household. By 1944, he was assigned to Headquarters and Service Company, 2nd Marines, 2nd Marine Division. Operation Forager loomed ahead, the assault on the Marianas. Saipan would be the key. Intelligence warned of 30,000 Japanese troops and unknown numbers of civilians armed with grenades and lies. Entire families had been told that capture was worse than death. Commanders predicted mass suicides. Guy's role was scout and observer, but he was restless. He knew what his officers could not, that language and respect could break through the walls of fear. While interpreters barked orders through bullhorns, using stiff military phrasing that often sounded foreign even to Japanese ears, Guy's approach was softer. He spoke like a friend, like a son, like someone who understood the heavy ties of family. Where propaganda promised demons, he offered something closer to trust. The invasion of Saipan began on June 15, 1944. Waves of Marines stormed the beaches under fire, pushing inland yard by yard. Behind them, artillery thundered. Before them, civilians hid in caves, clutching children while soldiers stood guard. It was into this chaos that Guy decided to act differently, stepping outside the script of war to write his own lines. The battle for Saipan raged like a storm, relentless and unforgiving. American forces pressed forward under scorching sun, each step purchased with lives. The Japanese defenders had sworn to fight to the last, and civilians had been persuaded that suicide was nobler than capture. It was in this grim environment that Guy Gabaldon began slipping away from his unit at night, ignoring orders that kept others close to the lines. He carried only a rifle for protection, but his true weapon was his voice. Alone, he crawled through brush and volcanic rock toward caves echoing with whispered prayers and nervous footsteps. When he reached their shadows, he did something no one else dared. He spoke, calmly and gently, in the familiar words he had learned years earlier. His sentences were not rigid commands but simple conversations, talk of food, of children's futures, of how surrender could mean living to rebuild Japan rather than dying in darkness. The words carried across the silence, cutting through fear. At first, the responses were uncertain. A handful of soldiers edged out, weapons lowered. Mothers clutched infants, stepping hesitantly toward the Marine who looked more like a boy than a monster. Each small group that surrendered seemed a miracle, proof that words could achieve what firepower could not. As the numbers grew, his fellow Marines took notice. Reports spread that Gabaldon had coaxed dozens, then hundreds, from their hiding places. Skeptics shook their heads. Such claims seemed impossible, but prisoners kept appearing, weary, hungry, alive. The power of his approach lay in its disarming contradiction. The propaganda had painted Americans as hulking beasts, merciless and cruel. Yet here stood a 5'4" teenager, speaking gently in their own language, offering dignity instead of brutality. His presence alone shattered the lies. By refusing to act like the monster they expected, he became believable. Meanwhile, the broader battle remained savage. On the cliffs that lined Saipan's coast, entire families leapt into the sea, convinced death was the only escape. The cries of children carried on the wind, a chilling reminder of how deeply fear had taken root. Guy knew he could not save everyone, but he refused to stop trying. Each night he returned to the caves, repeating his message with patience, sometimes for hours at a time, until the silence broke and footsteps emerged. Commanders who had doubted him began to reconsider. Standard interpreters shouted into bullhorns with little effect, but this Marine, unauthorized, unorthodox, was proving that empathy could dismantle even the strongest walls of fear. He became known among his peers as the Piper of Saipan, though at the time the nickname was passed around half in awe, half in disbelief. By early July, his influence had become undeniable. His tally of prisoners swelled, numbers that surpassed what entire units achieved through force. It was no longer a matter of chance. This was deliberate, calculated courage, and it was changing the narrative of the battle. The climax of Guy Gabaldon's mission came on July 8, 1944, a day that would etch his name into the annals of Marine Corps history. By then, the Japanese defenders had been driven north into the island's final strongholds. Entire families clustered in caves, soldiers prepared for one last stand, and the cliffs bore the haunting marks of suicides carried out in the name of honor. The atmosphere was suffocating, every shadow seemed ready to explode into violence, every whisper carried the weight of finality. That morning, Gabaldon moved alone once again into enemy territory. The air reeked of smoke and salt, the sound of distant gunfire echoing like thunder. Ahead lay a concentration of Japanese soldiers and civilians, numbering in the dozens, perhaps hundreds. Any other Marine would have called in artillery or demanded reinforcements. Guy did neither. Instead, he walked forward with the same quiet audacity that had guided him all along. He called out in Japanese, not the harsh tones of a conqueror, but the steady cadence of someone who understood. He spoke of food waiting with the Americans, of shelter for women and children, of treatment that was firm but fair. His words sought not to strip them of dignity, but to offer survival as an honorable choice. Hours passed as he repeated his appeals, unwavering, while inside the caves the people argued, hesitated, and listened. Then the impossible happened. First, a handful stepped into the light, weapons laid down. Then more followed, encouraged by the sight of others unhurt. What began as a trickle became a flood. Families emerged with trembling children, soldiers dropped rifles, and Guy walked them back toward American lines. When the final count was made, he had secured the surrender of 87 men, women, and children in a single day. For one Marine to accomplish that feat bordered on the unbelievable. Among his comrades, the story spread like wildfire. Officers who had once dismissed his methods as reckless now recognized the magnitude of what he had achieved. Colonel Walter Layer, Colonel John Schwabel, and Major James High would later testify to the authenticity of his numbers. His commanders drafted recommendations for the Medal of Honor, acknowledging that his courage had saved lives not by taking them, but by offering an alternative. Yet even as admiration grew, so too did whispers of doubt. Some questioned how such achievements could be verified when so much of his work was done alone, under the cover of darkness. For Guy, those questions mattered less than the faces he had seen, frightened eyes that softened when trust replaced terror. He had broken through the wall of propaganda one conversation at a time, and in doing so altered the course of the battle's closing days. On Saipan, where nearly 22,000 civilians would perish, his actions stood as rare victories for life amid overwhelming death. The cost of Saipan was staggering. By the time the island fell in July 1944, more than 3,000 Americans were dead. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers lay scattered across the fields and ridges, and entire communities of civilians had been erased by suicide or bombardment. Amid this devastation, the story of one Marine who had coaxed life out of despair seemed almost unreal. Official records credited Guy Gabaldon with capturing more than 1,000 people over the course of the campaign. Many sources placed the total closer to 1,500. These figures did not simply represent statistics. They marked lives spared from cliffs, grenades, and starvation. For his actions, Gabaldon first received the Silver Star, later upgraded to the Navy Cross in 1960. The citation spoke of his daring, of venturing alone into enemy caves and pillboxes, often under fire, returning with scores of prisoners. It described courage not just in battle but in defying fear itself. His commanding officers pressed for the Medal of Honor, yet the recommendation was downgraded. General Holland Smith, the expeditionary commander, judged that the unorthodox nature of Guy's work, carried out without witnesses, made the highest award too controversial. That decision sparked debate that lingers even decades later. Skeptics found room to question. Lieutenant Robert Schick, a Marine language officer, dismissed him as a self-promoter, suggesting that his numbers were exaggerated. The fact that Guy often worked alone made verification difficult. But 3 intelligence officers who served on Saipan publicly confirmed his feats years later on the television program This Is Your Life. To them, the evidence was undeniable. He had done what few believed possible. Beyond medals and arguments, his achievement carried profound meaning. On an island where propaganda urged civilians to leap into the sea rather than submit, one teenager had managed to turn the tide for many. His small stature, 5 feet 4, 123 pounds, made him far less threatening than the monstrous caricatures painted by Japanese military officers. His voice, familiar with everyday Japanese phrases, undermined the lies of torture and cannibalism. By presenting surrender not as disgrace, but as a means to protect family, he offered an honorable exit. These subtleties mattered in a culture where dignity weighed as heavily as survival. Even after being wounded by machine gun fire late in the campaign, Gabaldon pressed on with his efforts until evacuation was unavoidable. His persistence underscored a truth his commanders eventually recognized. Brute force alone could not achieve what understanding sometimes could. He had taken the role of interpreter and transformed it into something entirely new, a one-man psychological operation that saved lives in a battle better remembered for its carnage. When historians later assessed Saipan, they placed Gabaldon's story alongside the grim tally of casualties as a reminder that even in the Pacific's darkest struggles, there were flashes of humanity. His deeds stood as living proof that courage was not measured solely by how many enemies one killed, but by how many one convinced to live. After the guns fell silent on Saipan, Guy Gabaldon's life continued, though nothing could erase the memory of what he had seen. He returned to duty in the Pacific, but no later mission would match the scale of what he had accomplished on that island. In the years that followed, he carried both pride and frustration. The pride of saving more than 1,000 people, and the frustration of seeing his story overshadowed or doubted by those who preferred conventional tales of battlefield heroics. When Hollywood finally told his story in 1960, the result left him bitter. Held to Eternity cast a tall, blue-eyed actor as the young Marine, erasing his Mexican-American heritage and transforming his quiet negotiations into scenes of Hollywood bravado. The subtleties of language and cultural understanding were pushed aside in favor of gunfights and explosions. The real essence of what Guy had done, the patient conversations, the trust built in the shadows, was largely ignored. He watched the film with disappointment, knowing the truth was far more profound than fiction allowed. Years later, he sought to reclaim his voice. His memoir, Saipan, Suicide Island, gave his own version of events, filled with details no movie had captured. In it, he explained that his strength had never been firepower but respect. He had treated the enemy as human beings, not faceless foes. He had offered them a chance to live, not as broken captives, but as fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters who could still play a role in Japan's future. His words painted a picture of war rarely told, that sometimes victory came not from bullets but from understanding. For decades after, Guy lived quietly, raising a large family and running a fishing business on Saipan, the very island where he had once walked alone into darkness. His choice to remain there spoke volumes. Though he never reunited publicly with those he had saved, his presence on the island was itself a testament to the bond he had forged. He became a living reminder that survival and reconciliation were possible even in the aftermath of one of the Pacific's bloodiest battles. By the time of his death in 2006, Gabaldon had become a symbol, particularly within Hispanic and veteran communities. His burial at Arlington National Cemetery placed him among the honored dead of America's wars. Yet even now, his story remains underappreciated. No ships bear his name, no monuments dominate city squares. Instead, his legacy rests in classrooms, in quiet military lectures, and in the memories of those who recognize the value of cultural intelligence in war. What endures is not the controversy or the questions of numbers, it is the undeniable fact that one Marine, armed with nothing more than words and courage, persuaded men and women to choose life over death. On an island where despair had consumed thousands, Guy Gabaldon offered hope. His example remains timeless, proof that compassion can carve out a victory where violence fails.